What if I told you that the very thing modern psychology teaches men to embrace, getting in touch with their feminine side, is actually the psychological trap that destroys their capacity for authentic masculinity and meaningful relationships? For over 4 decades of analytical work, I have witnessed countless men stumble into what I call anima possession, a state so insidious that it masquerades as emotional growth while systematically dismantling a man's psychological foundation. The possessed man believes he has become more sensitive, more emotionally intelligent, more evolved than his toxic peers. But what he has actually become is a prisoner of his own unconscious, dancing to the whims of an archetypal force he neither understands nor controls. This isn't about suppressing emotion or returning to some primitive masculine ideal. This is about recognizing that when the anima, the feminine component of the male psyche, seizes control of a man's conscious personality, it creates a psychological catastrophe that manifests as chronic indecision, emotional volatility, and a peculiar form of narcissism disguised as empathy. The tragedy is that these men often appear to be the most psychologically sophisticated in our culture, yet they are among the most psychologically fragmented. Most people don't realize that what we're witnessing in modern culture isn't the evolution of masculine consciousness, but its systematic destruction through unconscious possession states. The possessed man exhibits a predictable constellation of symptoms that our society has been trained to celebrate rather than recognize as pathological. He becomes obsessed with his own emotional states, interpreting every feeling as profound insight while losing the capacity for decisive action. His relationships become theaters where he performs emotional sensitivity while unconsciously manipulating others through passive-aggressive displays of wounded vulnerability. He speaks constantly of boundaries while having none, of authenticity while living in a hall of mirrors created by his possessed psyche. The possessed man suffers from what I call chronic emotional incontinence, an inability to contain or direct his emotional responses appropriately. He floods every interaction with disproportionate feeling, mistaking emotional reactivity for depth and intensity for authenticity. His anger emerges not as clean masculine force, but as petulant rage infused with victimhood. His sadness becomes performative melancholy designed to elicit caregiving responses from others. His joy transforms into manic euphoria that demands constant validation. These men often gravitate towards spiritual movements, therapy cultures, or social justice causes, not from genuine calling, but because these environments provide acceptable venues for their emotional exhibitionism. The hidden costs of anima possession extend far beyond personal suffering. The possessed man becomes a psychological vampire, unconsciously draining the life force from those around him while believing himself to be offering healing and support. His children learn to walk on eggshells around his emotional volatility, developing hypervigilance and people-pleasing patterns that will haunt them into their own adulthood. His romantic partners find themselves in the exhausting position of managing a grown man's emotional weather while receiving little genuine masculine presence in return. The possessed man's friends gradually distance themselves from his endless need for emotional processing and validation, leaving him isolated and bitter about their emotional unavailability. The tragedy deepens when we realize that conventional therapeutic approaches often exacerbate anima possession rather than cure it. The modern therapeutic emphasis on emotional expression and feeling validation can inadvertently feed the very possession state it purports to heal. The possessed man enters therapy seeking to become more authentic and leaves even more identified with his emotional states, more convinced that his feelings are truth rather than psychological weather patterns. Traditional masculine mentoring structures that might have provided containment and guidance have largely disappeared, replaced by support groups and processing circles that often function as possession amplification chambers. I have spent decades mapping the psychological territories that lead to healing rather than deeper pathology, and I can promise you 5 proven methods to break free from anima possession and reclaim authentic masculine consciousness. These aren't feel-good platitudes or surface-level behavioral modifications. These are precise psychological technologies based on decades of clinical observation and grounded in the fundamental structures of human consciousness itself. You'll discover how to distinguish between genuine emotion and possession-driven reactivity, how to establish proper psychological containment without suppressing your authentic feeling life, and how to integrate your anima rather than be controlled by it. The research emerging from analytical psychology departments across Europe confirms what I observed decades ago. Men who learn to recognize and work with anima possession show measurable improvements in decision-making capacity, relationship satisfaction, and overall psychological resilience compared to those who remain unconsciously identified with their emotional states. The neuroscience of emotion regulation supports these ancient psychological truths. The brain literally rewires itself when consciousness learns to observe rather than be consumed by emotional content. You see, there's a fundamental difference between men who have learned to dance with their anima and those who have been consumed by it. The conscious man experiences the full spectrum of human emotion while maintaining what I call centered presence, the capacity to feel deeply without losing psychological stability. The possessed man, by contrast, is at the mercy of every emotional tide, believing his reactivity to be sensitivity and his instability to be depth. Once you understand these distinctions, you'll never mistake emotional possession for emotional intelligence the same way again. What we're really talking about here isn't the suppression of the feminine within men, but its conscious integration. The goal isn't to become emotionally numb or psychologically rigid, but to develop what the alchemists call the capacity to solve et coagula, to dissolve and reconstitute, to be fluid when fluidity serves and solid when solidity is required. This journey will challenge everything you've been taught about masculinity, emotion, and psychological development, but it will return you to your authentic power as a conscious man. But here's what most people miss about the anima. It's not simply your feminine side or your capacity for emotion. The anima is a living archetypal force that carries the wisdom of the eternal feminine, while simultaneously possessing the power to completely overwhelm masculine consciousness if approached unconsciously. Think of the anima like a powerful river that can either provide life-giving water for your psychological landscape or flood and destroy everything in its path, depending on whether you built proper channels and containments for its flow. Consider how a master craftsman relates to his tools. The hammer doesn't use the craftsman uses the hammer with skill and respect for its power. Similarly, the conscious man doesn't suppress his anima, but learns to work with its archetypal intelligence, while maintaining his role as the director of his own psychological orchestra. The possessed man, by contrast, has handed the conductor's baton to his anima, and now sits in the audience, wondering why the music has become chaotic and discordant. Here's another way to understand this dynamic. Imagine your psyche as a kingdom, with your conscious ego as the rightful king. The anima is like a powerful queen from a neighboring realm who has come to offer her wisdom and counsel. In a healthy psychological arrangement, the king consults with the queen, values her insights, and incorporates her wisdom into his decisions, while maintaining sovereignty over his own kingdom. In Anima possession, the queen has staged a bloodless coup, and the king now sits in the dungeon, while the queen rules with increasing tyranny, making decisions that serve her archetypal nature rather than the integrated well-being of the kingdom. The scientific understanding of this phenomenon becomes clearer when we examine what neuroscientists call emotional hijacking, the process by which the limbic system overrides the prefrontal cortex's executive functions. What I observed psychologically decades ago, brain imaging, now confirms when we become identified with emotional states rather than observing them. The very structures responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and reality testing become compromised. The possessed man isn't just emotionally reactive. He's literally operating with diminished cognitive capacity because his awareness has been absorbed into archetypal content. But here's the crucial insight. This possession doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of unconscious identification that often begins with what appears to be psychological growth. A man starts doing therapy, reading self-help books, or engaging in spiritual practices. He begins to access previously suppressed emotions and initially experiences this as liberation. But without proper psychological containment and discrimination, this opening becomes a doorway through which archetypal possession enters. What began as healthy emotional development transforms into chronic emotional reactivity disguised as sensitivity. Think about a time when you've witnessed a man who seemed emotionally evolved, yet somehow draining to be around. Perhaps he spoke eloquently about feelings and relationships, demonstrated apparent empathy and emotional intelligence, yet something felt off about his presence. Likely you were witnessing anima possession in action, the archetypal feminine expressing itself through a masculine personality structure without proper conscious integration. The result is often a kind of emotional performance that feels simultaneously sophisticated and manipulative, vulnerable and controlling. The conventional approach to masculine emotional development completely misses this crucial distinction between emotional integration and emotional possession. Most therapeutic modalities encourage men to get in touch with their feelings without providing the psychological tools necessary to maintain conscious relationship with emotional content, rather than becoming unconsciously identified with it. It's like teaching someone to open a dam without teaching them how to build spillways and channels to direct the water constructively. This is precisely why so many men who have done extensive emotional work still struggle with chronic relationship difficulties, decision paralysis, and a peculiar form of narcissism that masquerades as heightened sensitivity. They've opened to their emotional nature without developing the psychological musculature necessary to contain and direct that opening. The result is not integration but possession, a state where archetypal content has hijacked conscious awareness rather than being integrated into it. The solution isn't to close back down emotionally or retreat into traditional masculine stoicism. The solution is to develop what I call conscious relationship with the anima, a way of honoring its wisdom while maintaining your sovereignty as the conscious director of your psychological life. This requires a fundamental shift in how you understand the relationship between thinking and feeling, consciousness and emotion, masculine and feminine principles within your own psyche. Most people approach their emotions like they approach the weather, as something that happens to them rather than something they participate in creating. But here's what the ancient wisdom traditions understood that modern psychology has forgotten. Emotions are not just biological responses or psychological reactions. They are doorways into archetypal realms that can either enrich your conscious life or completely overwhelm it, depending on how you approach them. The possessed man has confused emotional expression with emotional consciousness. He believes that feeling deeply means being consumed by feelings, that sensitivity requires sacrificing psychological stability, that authenticity demands emotional incontinence. But true emotional consciousness is actually the opposite. It's the capacity to feel everything while being identified with nothing. It's what the Buddhist tradition call awareness aware of itself, and what I call ego-anima collaboration. This collaboration requires recognizing that emotions are not yours in the possessive sense, but rather visitors in the temple of your consciousness. When grief arises, it's not my grief, but rather grief itself, visiting through your particular psychological constellation. When anger emerges, it's not my anger, but anger itself, seeking expression through your circumstances. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's the difference between psychological freedom and psychological bondage. The possessed man says, I am angry, and becomes absorbed into the archetypal energy of anger, losing access to his broader psychological resources. The conscious man says, anger is arising in my awareness, and maintains the spaciousness to feel the anger fully, while accessing his wisdom, compassion, and strategic thinking simultaneously. The first response leads to reactivity and regret, the second leads to appropriate response and integration. But this psychological repositioning isn't just a cognitive trick or spiritual bypassing technique. It requires developing what I call psychological musculature, the actual capacity to maintain centered awareness while allowing intense emotional content to move through your system. Most men have never developed this capacity because our culture provides no training in it. We're taught either to suppress emotions or to express them, but never to dance with them consciously. Think of a jazz musician improvising with a complex piece. He doesn't suppress the musical possibilities or become lost in them. He maintains creative awareness while allowing the music to flow through him, shaping and being shaped by the artistic forces at play. Similarly, conscious relationship with the anima requires this kind of creative collaboration, allowing archetypal energies to inform and inspire while maintaining your role as the conscious artist of your own life. The programming metaphors are particularly relevant here because anima possession literally rewrites your psychological software without your conscious consent. The possessed man develops what programmers call recursive loops, emotional patterns that repeat endlessly without resolution, because the consciousness that could provide resolution has been absorbed into the pattern itself. Breaking these loops requires stepping outside the emotional programming and observing it from a meta level of awareness. Now, let me share with you the most powerful technique I've discovered for breaking anima possession and establishing conscious relationship with archetypal feminine energy. This technique has been used by depth psychologists, spiritual practitioners, and high-performance individuals across cultures for centuries, though it's rarely taught in its complete form. Elite performers in every field, from world-class athletes to master negotiators to renowned artists, understand something about emotional mastery that the general population has never learned. They know how to access the full power of their emotional intelligence while maintaining what sports psychologists call optimal arousal states. They can feel deeply while thinking clearly, respond authentically while behaving strategically, remain open while staying centered. The neuroscience behind this capacity is fascinating. Brain imaging studies of individuals trained in contemplative practices show increased gray matter density in areas associated with emotional regulation, attention control, and self-awareness. More importantly, these individuals demonstrate what researchers call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe their own psychological processes without being consumed by them. This is precisely the neurological foundation of what I've called conscious relationship with the anima. The technique itself is deceptively simple, but requires consistent practice to master. I call it archetypal witnessing, and it consists of 4 distinct phases that must be learned sequentially. First, you develop the capacity to recognize when archetypal content is beginning to activate in your system. This recognition phase requires learning to distinguish between ordinary emotional responses and archetypal possession states. Ordinary emotions have clear triggered, proportionate intensity, and natural resolution patterns. Archetypal possession creates disproportionate emotional responses, unclear triggered, and recursive emotional loops that resist resolution. Second, you learn to create what I call conscious space around the archetypal activation. Instead of immediately expressing or suppressing the emotional content, you practice holding it in awareness while maintaining your psychological center. This isn't suppression. You're not pushing the emotion away. It's more like becoming a spacious container that can hold intense content without being overwhelmed by it. Emotion is fully felt and honored, but your identity doesn't become absorbed into it. Third, you engage in what I call archetypal dialogue, a conscious conversation with the emotional content to understand its deeper message and purpose. The anima speaks through emotions, but its communications are symbolic rather than literal. Rage might be carrying a message about violated boundaries. Sadness might be pointing toward values that need attention. Fear might be highlighting risks that require strategic consideration. The possessed man takes these emotional communications literally. The conscious man learns to decode their symbolic significance. Fourth, you practice conscious integration, taking the wisdom offered by the archetypal content and translating it into appropriate conscious action. This might mean setting boundaries, changing directions, communicating needs, or simply acknowledging important values. The key is that the action emerges from conscious choice rather than emotional compulsion. The most common mistake men make when learning this technique is trying to rush through the process or skip the containment phase. Our culture has trained us to believe that authentic emotion requires immediate expression, but this is actually a recipe for possession. Conscious emotional expression often requires a period of internal processing and integration before external expression becomes appropriate and effective. Another common error is using this technique as a sophisticated form of emotional suppression. The goal isn't to control or manipulate your emotional life, but to develop a conscious collaborative relationship with it. You're not trying to eliminate emotional responsiveness, but to ensure that your responses emerge from integrated awareness rather than unconscious reactivity. The timing and frequency of practice are crucial for developing mastery. I recommend beginning with 5-minute daily sessions where you deliberately recall a recent emotional activation and practice moving through the 4 phases retrospectively. This builds the neural pathways necessary for real-time application. After several weeks of consistent practice, you can begin applying the technique during low-intensity emotional activations, gradually working up to more challenging situations. What makes this technique so powerful is its cumulative effect on your psychological architecture. Each time you successfully witness, and integrate archetypal content rather than being possessed by it. You strengthen what I call your ego anima bridge, the psychological structure that allows conscious collaboration between masculine and feminine principles within your psyche. Over time, this bridge becomes so robust that emotional intensity actually enhances rather than compromises your decision-making capacity. The technique also creates what researchers call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle variations in emotional experience. Instead of experiencing only anger, you begin to recognize frustration, irritation, outrage, righteous indignation, and dozens of other distinct emotional frequencies. This increased discrimination allows for much more precise and effective responses to life circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, this practice transforms your relationship with the unknown aspects of your own psyche. Instead of being ambushed by unexpected emotional responses, you develop the confidence to explore your psychological depths with curiosity and courage. The anima becomes an ally in your development rather than a force of unconscious chaos. Now let me reveal to you the systematic process that transforms anima possession into conscious anima integration, what I call the individuation protocol. This isn't merely a therapeutic technique, but a comprehensive system for psychological development that addresses the root causes of possession while building lasting psychological resilience. The system works by progressively strengthening four distinct psychological capacities that must be developed in sequence, much like building a house requires laying a foundation before constructing walls. Most approaches to masculine emotional development fail because they attempt to work with advanced psychological material without establishing these foundational capacities first. It's like trying to perform surgery with trembling hands. The intention might be noble, but the result is often more damage than healing. The first capacity is what I call psychological sovereignty, the ability to maintain a clear sense of self while navigating intense interpersonal and intrapsychic dynamics. The possessed man has poor psychological boundaries. His mood depends on others' moods. His thoughts are constantly influenced by others' opinions, and his emotional state fluctuates based on external circumstances. Psychological sovereignty doesn't mean becoming closed or defensive, but rather developing what I call permeable strength, the ability to be open and responsive while maintaining your psychological center. The technical mechanism here involves strengthening the neural networks associated with interoceptive awareness, your brain's ability to monitor your internal physiological and psychological states. Research shows that individuals with strong interoceptive awareness are significantly less susceptible to emotional contagion and psychological manipulation. They can distinguish between their own emotional states and emotional content they're picking up from their environment. This distinction is crucial for anyone seeking to work with the anima consciously rather than being overwhelmed by it. The second capacity is archetypal discrimination, the ability to recognize when you're dealing with personal psychological material versus archetypal content. Personal material has clear biographical origins and responds well to conventional therapeutic approaches. Archetypal material, however, has a numinous quality that seems to originate from depths beyond personal history. It carries symbolic meaning, mythic significance, and transformative potential, but it can also be overwhelming if approached without proper preparation. The possessed man treats all psychological content as personal, trying to analyze archetypal activation with purely rational approaches or trace mythic imagery back to childhood experiences. This is like trying to understand thunder by examining individual raindrops. Archetypal content requires archetypal consciousness, a way of engaging with symbolic meaning and mythic significance that honors the transpersonal dimensions of psychological experience. The third capacity is dynamic integration, the ability to hold opposing psychological forces in creative tension rather than trying to resolve them prematurely. The anima often presents itself through paradox, strength and vulnerability, independence and connection, logic and intuition. The possessed man becomes identified with one pole of these paradoxes and projects the other onto external people or circumstances. The conscious man learns to embody the creative tension between opposing forces, discovering that integration often means learning to dance with paradox rather than resolving it. The fourth capacity is purposeful expression, the ability to channel archetypal energies into constructive action in the world. The anima carries tremendous creative and transformative power, but this power requires conscious direction to become beneficial rather than destructive. The possessed man either suppresses this power or allows it to express chaotically through emotional reactivity and interpersonal drama. The conscious man learns to channel archetypal energies into creative projects, meaningful relationships, and purposeful action that serves both his individual development and the broader community. Before implementing this protocol, most men experience what I call unconscious cycling. Their psychological life resembles a weather system beyond their control, with periods of calm interrupted by sudden storms of emotional reactivity, relationship drama, or existential confusion. They react to their psychological weather rather than learning to work with it consciously. After mastering the protocol, men report feeling like they've moved from being passengers in their psychological life to being conscious pilots, still subject to atmospheric conditions, but able to navigate skillfully through any weather. The transformation scenarios are dramatic and consistent. I've observed men who were chronically indecisive develop the capacity for clear, confident choice-making. Men who struggled with emotional volatility learn to maintain equanimity while accessing the full spectrum of human feeling. Men who felt overwhelmed by their sensitivity discover how to use their emotional intelligence as a strategic advantage rather than a liability. Men who were isolated in their emotional intensity learn to create authentic intimacy without sacrificing psychological autonomy. But the most profound transformation involves what I call identity upgrade, shifting from identifying yourself as someone who has emotions to recognizing yourself as the conscious space within which emotions arise and dissolve. This isn't detachment or spiritual bypassing, but rather the development of what contemplative traditions call witness consciousness, the capacity to experience life fully while maintaining perspective and choice about how to respond. The system also includes specific protocols for addressing what I call sabotage patterns, the unconscious behaviors that keep men trapped in possession states even when they consciously desire freedom. These patterns often include seeking validation for emotional reactivity from partners or therapists, using emotional intensity as a form of interpersonal control, creating drama to avoid taking responsibility for practical life circumstances, and maintaining victim narratives that justify remaining unconscious. Let me now share with you the most direct and immediately applicable method for breaking anima possession, a practice I call conscious embodiment. Unlike purely mental or emotional techniques, this approach uses your physical body as an anchor for consciousness and a laboratory for psychological transformation. The power of physical action in psychological transformation cannot be overstated. While the mind can be deceived and emotions can be manipulated, the body provides immediate, unfiltered feedback about your psychological state. When you're possessed by the anima, specific physical patterns emerge: shallow breathing, chronic tension in particular areas, postural collapse or rigidity, and a quality of physical presence that feels simultaneously agitated and depleted. Conscious embodiment works by establishing what I call somatic sovereignty, using your physical presence as a foundation for psychological stability, rather than allowing your body to be jerked around by emotional weather patterns. This isn't about suppressing emotions through physical control, but rather about creating a stable platform from which to engage with emotional content consciously. The practice has multiple variations, but they all share certain core elements. The foundational version involves what I call grounded presence protocol. Find a private space where you can stand comfortably without interruption for 10 to 15 minutes. Begin by establishing conscious contact with the ground beneath your feet, feeling the solid support of the earth through your entire body. This isn't just visualization, you're literally engaging your proprioceptive system to create a felt sense of being supported by something larger and more stable than your emotional weather. Next, establish what I call breath sovereignty by taking conscious control of your breathing pattern. Most men who struggle with anima possession breathe in a way that actually amplifies emotional reactivity, shallow, rapid breathing that keeps their nervous system in a state of chronic activation. Instead, practice breathing that engages your diaphragm fully, creating a rhythm that signals safety and stability to your nervous system. The specific pattern is less important than the conscious intention to use your breath as a tool for psychological stability, rather than allowing it to be unconsciously driven by emotional states. The third element involves postural consciousness, deliberately arranging your physical structure in a way that supports psychological strength rather than collapse. This doesn't mean rigid military posture, but rather what martial artists call relaxed alertness, a physical stance that can respond appropriately to any situation without being either collapsed or overextended. Your spine elongates naturally, your shoulders relax away from your ears, and your entire structure conveys what I call grounded availability, ready for whatever emerges without being driven by reactivity. The historical validation for this approach spans every wisdom tradition on Earth. Indigenous cultures used specific physical practices to maintain psychological equilibrium and establish proper relationship with spiritual forces. Martial arts traditions developed elaborate systems for using physical training to cultivate mental stability and emotional mastery. Even contemporary neuroscience confirms that specific physical practices can literally rewire the brain in ways that support emotional regulation and psychological resilience. What makes this practice particularly powerful for addressing anima possession is that it works with the energetic dimension of archetypal activation. The anima doesn't just create emotional responses, it creates specific energetic patterns that can be felt and worked with directly through conscious embodiment. When you learn to recognize these energetic patterns in your body, you can address anima possession at its energetic roots rather than just managing its emotional symptoms. The immediate engagement opportunity comes from recognizing that you can practice elements of this technique right now as you read these words. Without leaving your current position, you can establish conscious contact with whatever is supporting your body, the chair, the floor, the ground. You can take 3 conscious breaths that engage your full respiratory capacity. You can adjust your posture to convey psychological strength rather than collapse. These micro practices begin building the somatic foundation necessary for more advanced psychological work, but the real power emerges when you begin using this practice during emotional activation rather than just as a daily maintenance routine. The moment you notice Anima possession beginning, whether it shows up as emotional reactivity, decision paralysis, or interpersonal drama, you immediately ground yourself through conscious embodiment. Instead of trying to think your way out of possession or express your way through it, you establish somatic sovereignty first, then engage with the emotional content from a place of physical stability. The momentum building effect is remarkable. Each time you successfully use conscious embodiment to maintain psychological stability during emotional activation, you literally strengthen the neural pathways that support emotional mastery. Your body begins to remember what stability feels like, even during emotional storms. Your nervous system develops confidence in its ability to remain coherent during challenging circumstances. Your entire psychophysical system begins to embody the qualities you're seeking to develop, rather than just thinking about them conceptually. Advanced practitioners often discover that conscious embodiment becomes a gateway into what I call somatic intelligence, a way of accessing information about situations and relationships through physical intuition rather than just mental analysis. The body often knows things that the mind hasn't yet figured out, and the anima frequently communicates through physical sensations and energetic patterns that can be decoded through embodied awareness. Different situations call for different applications of this practice. When dealing with relationship conflicts, you might use boundary embodiment, physically establishing your personal space while maintaining openness to connection. When facing important decisions, you might practice choice embodiment, physically exploring how different options feel in your body before committing mentally. When processing difficult emotions, you might use container embodiment, creating a physical sense of spaciousness that can hold intense emotional content without being overwhelmed by it. The frequency recommendations vary based on your current level of anima possession. Men who are deeply possessed often benefit from practicing conscious embodiment multiple times daily, using it as a reset button whenever they notice themselves becoming emotionally reactive or energetically scattered. Men who have established basic emotional stability might use the practice once daily as maintenance, and whenever they encounter particularly challenging circumstance. What's crucial to understand is that this practice doesn't eliminate emotional responsiveness or make you into some kind of stoic robot. Instead, it provides a stable foundation from which your full emotional range can express appropriately rather than chaotically. You become more emotionally available, not less, because you're no longer afraid of being overwhelmed by emotional intensity. The ultimate goal is what I call embodied presence, a quality of being in your body that conveys both strength and openness, stability and responsiveness, groundedness and availability. This presence becomes a gift you offer to every interaction and relationship. People feel safer around you because your energy is consistent and reliable. They feel more authentic around you because your embodied presence gives them permission to be genuine rather than performative. The key to successful implementation of everything I've shared lies not in perfect technique, but in what I call identity archaeology, the systematic excavation of who you actually are beneath the layers of possession, conditioning, and unconscious identification. Most men have never encountered their authentic self because they've been unconsciously identified with psychological content since childhood. You see, anima possession isn't actually the problem, it's a symptom of a deeper issue. The real problem is that most men have never learned to distinguish between their essential identity and the various psychological contents that move through their awareness. They think they are their emotions, their thoughts, their roles, their wounds, their achievements, their failures. But all of these are simply phenomena arising within the space of consciousness that you actually are. The possessed man says, I am anxious, and becomes anxiety itself. The conscious man recognizes anxiety is arising within my awareness and maintains access to his full range of responses. The possessed man says, I am angry, and becomes consumed by rage. The conscious man notices anger is present and can access both the information anger provides and the wisdom needed to respond appropriately. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's the difference between psychological slavery and psychological freedom. This identity transformation requires what I call disidentification practice, systematically recognizing all the things you are not so that you can discover what you actually are. You are not your emotional states, though you can experience them fully. You are not your thoughts, though you can think clearly and creatively. You are not your roles, though you can fulfill them excellently. You are not your history, though you can learn from it. You are not even your personality, though you can express through it authentically. So what are you? You are a conscious space within which all of these phenomena arise and dissolve. You are what the mystics call pure awareness and what I call the witnessing consciousness. This isn't a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that can be directly experienced through proper psychological training. When you identify yourself as consciousness itself rather than the contents of consciousness, anima possession becomes impossible because there's no separate self to be possessed. The certainty building comes from recognizing that this isn't about becoming someone different, but about remembering who you've always been beneath the layers of unconscious identification. Every moment of clarity you've ever experienced, every instance of genuine peace, every time you felt completely authentic, these were glimpses of your essential nature shining through the clouds of psychological conditioning. Previous attempts at emotional development may have failed because they were trying to improve the possessed personality rather than awakening you to your essential identity. It's like trying to improve a dream character instead of waking up from the dream. No amount of emotional processing or behavioral modification can free you from anima possession as long as you remain identified with the psychological content rather than recognizing yourself as the conscious space within which that content arises. When you make this shift from content identification to consciousness identification, everything changes. Emotions become information rather than identity. Thoughts become tools rather than masters. Relationships become opportunities for mutual awakening rather than arenas for unconscious drama. The anima becomes an ally in your conscious development rather than a force of possession. This isn't about spiritual bypassing or premature transcendence. You don't leave the human experience behind, you show up for it more fully because you're no longer afraid of being overwhelmed by it. You can feel everything without being consumed by anything. You can engage completely without losing yourself in the engagement. You can love deeply without sacrificing your psychological autonomy. The moment you recognize yourself as consciousness itself, you become naturally attractive to others who are seeking authentic relationship rather than unconscious codependency. Your presence becomes a stabilizing force in every environment because you're no longer adding unconscious reactivity to already challenging situations. You become someone others can rely on for both emotional availability and psychological stability. What we've explored here represents a return to the ancient understanding that true masculinity isn't about suppressing the feminine, but about dancing with it consciously. The goal isn't to eliminate emotional responsiveness, but to transform it from unconscious reactivity into conscious responsiveness. You don't become less human, you become more human because you're no longer afraid of your own humanity. The men who master these principles don't become perfect, but they become authentic. They don't eliminate challenges from their lives, but they respond to challenges from consciousness rather than unconsciousness. They don't avoid emotional intensity, but they dance with it rather than being consumed by it. This is the path of conscious masculinity, not the denial of the anima, but its conscious integration. Your journey toward psychological freedom begins the moment you recognize that you have a choice in how you relate to emotional content, rather than being automatically overwhelmed by it. Every moment offers a new opportunity to practice consciousness rather than unconsciousness, integration rather than possession, authenticity rather than reactivity. I encourage you to share in the comments below one specific situation where you've noticed anima possession operating in your own life or in the men around you. Recognition is the first step toward transformation, and your willingness to look honestly at these patterns demonstrates the courage required for genuine psychological development. The man who can see his possession clearly is already beginning to free himself from it.